Hello there, fellow true crime junkies, skeptics, freethinkers, and those of you that wanted to take a look at the dark side. This is American Crime Journal. I'm Damian Moore, and yes, we're going to play that intro. Thank you and welcome to ACJ's first episode, Derailed, Operation Underground Railroad. This has been such a long time in the making, and I want to thank all of our supporters over the last 3 years that have helped us make this happen. And for those of you that have just maybe stumbled upon us or have just recently heard about us or are interested in human trafficking or have been following O.U.R. and is looking to see, hey, what's this all about? I welcome you too. To be 100% transparent, our investigation into Operation Underground Railroad didn't just start out of nowhere. It began with our last investigative series into Carly Gousset. And it started because of John Lines, who is the president of operations at Operation Underground Railroad. First and foremost, when I'm talking to people, and whether it's friends, family, or people I'm interviewing about a particular case, or police departments, experts, professors, me and Lynn Packer were talking, it seems that the definition of human trafficking has taken on a life of its own. One thing's for certain, the majority of Americans, people I've talked to, as well as statistics, believe that human trafficking is literally suburban white girls being abducted and sold into sex slavery, literally chained to the beds and being drugged up with heroin or some other narcotic. And yet, it's fiction. Believe it or not, there's not a single documented case in which an American girl has been abducted, smuggled out of the country, and sold into sex slavery. And that's according to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. However, organizations like Operation Underground Railroad have no problem perpetuating this myth. Now, supposedly, the founder of Operation Underground Railroad is a former CIA agent, and he worked in Homeland Security. According to him, he was an expert in terrorism. But his boss recruited him to investigate child sex trafficking because of his Latter-day Saints faith. That's what qualified Tim Ballard to start a task force within Homeland Security, which we would later find out is not true. But first things first, if we're going to talk about Operation Underground Railroad, we need to talk about their purpose, their function, and what is the core subject that this is all about. And that is human trafficking. The definition seems simple enough and self-explanatory, and for experts and credible law enforcement, it usually is. It's one person or organization that has control or agency over a person and sells, gifts a person to another. As one former FBI agent who spent 40 years not only investigating and arresting human traffickers, but actually training future specialists in the agency, and later developed the curriculum for Homeland Security after its inception. He told me it's the act, the transaction of selling, gifting, exchanging, or trading ownership or control of a human being or beings to another. So why is it just the act? Well, The United States Criminal Code, as well as international law, has specific laws and penalties, definitions specifically dealing with other components of what some deem as slavery. Slavery is just essentially a person in bondage in definition. However, when you're talking about crime and criminal code penalties and different acts, there's different components and different things that people do or criminals in that act, as well as different violations of a person's civil liberties, freedom, or other disgusting crimes that could be committed or perpetrated against that person. For example, abducting a person is kidnapping. One person dominates and has control, or if they abducted them and give them to someone else, it's not the act of kidnapping again. Same with drug trafficking. Corner dealers and drug users are charged with intent to deliver, delivery of a controlled substance, or possession, respectively. They are not charged with drug trafficking. Trafficking is not for the transaction for the end user and that supplier, but specifically those who supply high-level distributors. Simple enough? Thought so. But not so fast. Now, for those of you in the know and have been with us for a long time, you know that over the course of the last year, ACJI investigated Jonathan Lyons and Operation Underground Railroad for their involvement into the disappearance of Carly Gousset, or more specifically, the search for her, which ultimately led to us investigating Tim Ballard. And we quickly realized that in order to understand and properly report on this subject, we had to get a clear definition of human trafficking, a bare bones definition to set a standard, a foundation to build upon. That way it goes across the board. Now, you would think that an organization that portrays itself as the experts, that rescued 5,000 children, supposedly, and the founder, Tim Ballard, who brags that he sits on Donald Trump's Human Trafficking Advisory Board, you would think that there's a clear, concise definition, a standard in which their protocols and operations are based upon. Well, you'd be wrong. Just like I was. Within minutes, we realized O.U.R.'s founder, Tim Ballard, was an LDS fundamentalist and a hardcore right-wing grifter. As you know, irrespective of your politics, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, any organization, the leadership of that organization, that is tied to a particular religion, a political group, or leans very far on a political spectrum, or leans hardcore on a political philosophy, especially the far right, due to their belief in the supernatural and religion, that the organization's values, core fundamentals, and viewpoint is skewed, and it's under the influence of that particular religion, the religious leadership, and if it's a political group, that political group's objectives and political theories and philosophy. Just so we're clear, and in the quest for truth, to maintain integrity and high standards, we didn't stop there and just operate off the assumption, though it was common knowledge, that he was an LDS fundamentalist and propagated a lot of far-right political ideology. We made sure before we were reported as such. As we cover this topic, you will see now and in future episodes there are 3 definitions of human trafficking being used. Now, to be perfectly honest and transparent, there are 2 legitimized definitions of human trafficking one right and one wrong, and that wrong one is because a political party was hijacked by evangelicals, and they use it as a dog whistle and for gaslighting to get some certain laws passed under an attempt to make something else illegal. But then we have a third definition. It's Tim Ballard's and O.U.R.'s definition of human trafficking. And while they didn't necessarily invent this definition, it's been around for years under different banners and battle cries, like white slavery and, more recently, stranger danger, while those who peddled and pandered and fear-mongered stranger danger and white slavery were genuinely afraid of it, so afraid that it actually became a hysteria. Now, those who are peddling and pandering human trafficking, by their own admission and in internal documents, they took a very real and isolated problem and began expanding the definition and framing other things as human trafficking to bolster their numbers and to make it seem more widespread than it really is. And they began to apply the term human trafficking to some things that these ultra-religious right-wing fundamentalists see as social and moral stains on society. What Tim Ballard and O.U.R. would do is brand it, market it, and fearmonger, hoping to create a reality TV series, but it grew into something else. When we use the term human trafficking, we apply the UN standard definition because that is accepted worldwide and was agreed upon by all democracies. It is the definition accepted by world governments, professionals, and experts. So, what is the definition? The protocol to prevent, suppress, punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, supplementing the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, was adopted, opened for signature, ratification, and accession by the General Assembly Resolution 5525 on November 15, 2000. United States ratified it. Human trafficking is defined as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, or of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or the benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. The resolution is very specific, almost with surgical precision. So, how does the United States define human trafficking? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and its subsequent reauthorizations define human trafficking as A. Sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or when the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. And B. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision of obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, coercion, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Words and definitions are the same, but there is a major difference in there. The U.S. Criminal Code essentially states that a person who is induced to perform sex acts that has not attained 18 years of age is considered human trafficking. So essentially, we have now a law in which if even the person is not trafficked, it is considered human trafficking. Let's be very clear about something, because I think a lot of people out here perpetuate that these laws are this way to protect children. No, it doesn't, because if it protects the children, why would they arrest those children for prostitution? I can't tell you how many cases I looked at of human trafficking in which these girls were arrested and convicted of prostitution. So, where was the protection? Did you know that in 47 states in the United States, the age of consent at minimum in 47 states is 17? Now, there are some states that state that if you are a person of authority, like a teacher or influence, to where you might be able to use that as leverage, it would be considered statutory rape. However, if you just met a 17-year-old at a club and you're 50 years old and you have sex with them, it's perfectly legal. Now, there are other states, and that's 47 states, where the minimum of the law is 17. But let's not be confused. There are other states where the age of consent, without parental consent, without any type of nonsense, teacher or no teacher, the age is as young as 14, and some go down to 11 and 12 years old. Now, some of those statutes will state if they're within 3 years of age, so like if you're in Illinois and you're 18 and have sex with a 16-year-old, it's legal because you're within 3 years of age. So, how does Operation Underground Railroad define human trafficking? Well, over the years, it seems to have evolved. It's cherry-picked, and the reason why it's cherry-picked is because when the LDS Church was engaged in what would technically be human trafficking, Tim Ballard turned that into some type of nonsense about how the early women didn't have enough husbands and they needed somebody to protect them. So that's why there was polygamy and they were being sold against their will. But enough of that. That's a whole nother subject. So how does Operation Underground Railroad define human trafficking? Well, first and foremost, the one thing that Tim Ballard repeatedly and continues to say the biggest problem with human trafficking is pornography. Tim Ballard has stated that 100% of men who rape children are porn addicts. Ballard has stated, probably thousands of times, that 100% of men who rape children are porn addicts, and consequently, porn is creating a lot of the demand for child sex, and that the traffickers are of different ethnicities and genders, ages, and religions, but they all have one thing in common, too. They all suffer an addiction to porn. Now, we're going to elaborate this on a later episode, but there's something to think about. Notice what he's stating. They suffer from an addiction to porn. Now, one tip I'm going to give you, if you've ever researched and investigated anything, is when you look at the people that run or the fundamentals of the individuals that are involved in these organizations, and this can apply to anything, whether you're looking into medical research or research into some type of scientific theory. You look at the people and where do they get these ideas, but you need to look at like the people they're around, the schools they went to, the church they belong to, and what is the LDS Church saying around this time? And Tim Ballard's talking about these things. But notice what they're saying. They're suffering from a porn addiction. And just to give you a hint, the LDS Church does not believe in the concept of predators. They believe that sin is sort of like a disease, an affliction that they can cure. But we'll get more into that in another episode. What is the number 2 cause of human trafficking? Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know right where our religious right-wing fundamentalists are going to go with this. Homosexuality. Ballard has stated in LDS circles and to his inner circle that the majority of homosexuals were victims of pedophilia and pornography, and that a good portion of them turn into pedophiles and human traffickers. I'm disgusted. And the science is we already know that science this is an old myth that continues to be perpetuated. This is exactly right now we're hearing about this cabal in Hollywood, the Hollywood pedophile cabal that are abducting children and raping them. This is all rooted in old myths and conspiracy theories and the religious right's attack on gay people. Remember, for decades now, the religious right has said that Hollywood is packed with homosexuals, and the religious right continues to perpetuate the myth that child molestation is what homosexuals do, despite the fact that over 90% of the children molested in the world are women. Yet they continue to reverse that, and notice how Tim Ballard is using old myths. And there's a reason why, ladies and gentlemen, that Tim Ballard is using old myths in this type of definition of human trafficking, because he knows it grabs the attention of the religious right. Now, he may not personally believe it, but it is a sell to the other religious fundamentalists and Republicans out there. So that's why you're seeing a lot of this human trafficking nonsense growing from conservative circles. And for you conservatives that are not so much believing in that, you have to understand and you have to take ownership here. This is where this propaganda is coming from, because there's nothing backing this up. What else is the cause of human trafficking, according to Tim Ballard? Prostitution. Ballard claims that 95% of prostitution is forced, that women are not sexual beings but nurturers. Ballard also calls Johns, men who purchases sex, traffickers. Notice what he's doing here. There's a pattern here. He's calling all pedophiles that rape children traffickers. He's calling the traffickers traffickers. He's calling gay people traffickers. See a pattern here? This is why this statistic begins to grow, and this is why the lines start getting blurred, and nobody knows what human trafficking is. But it doesn't stop there. Pimps, he calls traffickers, even though I don't think he understands quite pimp-prostitute relationship. However, when you hear Tim talk about pimps, you hear a lot of the cliches and platitudes of people that think about pimps. Now, this is how I know Tim Ballard's full of shit on this, and there's one thing I'm going to be upfront about. I grew up around prostitution my whole life, 17 years. I lived with my grandmother half the time in a projects, Section 8 home, a projects, Maple Terrace in Aurora, Illinois. One block over was Hill Ave and 2nd, and that is where APD on the east side allowed prostitution to go so that they can contain it. The house next door to me and my mom's house was ran by Johnny Stewart. When she passed away, she was called the matriarch of prostitution in Aurora for at least 40 years. So I don't think Tim Ballard quite understands the complexities and how this works, but he calls pimps traffickers. And what he doesn't understand is usually pimps are the boyfriend. About 95% of pimps are the boyfriends or husbands of these women, and usually they're just drug addicts and they don't work. They're not actually pimping the women out. However, Tim Ballard doesn't know that because he's lived this privileged life and he's never actually spent the time with people that's beneath him, or so he thinks. Another thing that Ballard mixes with human trafficking and uses to define human trafficking is illegal immigration. He loves using things like MS-13, even though it's an American gang, Ballard contends that 800,000 to 1 million kids each and every year are being trafficked in and out of the United States. So when Ballard was called out about these numbers, and as human trafficking started to look like a huge myth and the media started to catch on to all this propaganda, the numbers started to change. So then Ballard then stated the State Department reported that 10,000 children are smuggled into the United States annually and forced into the commercial sex trade. As law enforcement agencies and Homeland Security and the FBI began to crunch numbers, people asked the State Department, where did they get those numbers? Well, guess what? According to the State Department, they don't know where Tim Ballard and O.U.R. got that number. So I did something else. I believe Lynn Packer confirmed it. I believe other journalists has called and confirmed it. I know the Washington Post actually called to see where Tim Ballard and O.U.R. got the number. So I decided to call the State Department to see where the hell that number came from. And they acted like I was pestering them. So I was actually referred to the Office to Monitor and Control Trafficking in Persons. And so the Office to Monitor and Control Trafficking in Persons stated specifically, listen, there is no number. I'm not sure what you're talking about, sir. So I asked them specifically, is Tim Ballard lying? And they said, we're not sure if he's lying, but he didn't get the number from us. Well, we're going to cover this in another episode. Let's just go over some numbers of actual human trafficking cases. In 2019, the Department of Homeland Security opened just 1,024 investigations related to human trafficking. Of those cases, the DOJ formally opened 607 investigations, and 65 of those cases involved Department of Defense personnel, which was a decrease from 119 in 2018. And out of that 607, the Department of Justice initiated a grand total of 220 human trafficking prosecutions that secured 475 convictions. However, we continue to hear numbers like millions of kids are being trafficked each and every year. In another episode, we are going to dig deeper into what some of these prosecutions and convictions were, and I think you will be surprised. No matter where you sit on the political spectrum or with your religious beliefs, it is quite obvious that Tim Ballard and Operation Underground Railroad have exploited and manipulated and distorted the definition of human trafficking. But the question is why? Did they distort it for money? Are they truly concerned about children in black and brown countries? Or is there another reason? Is there another goal? Are they trying to save perhaps Mormon men from being tempted by the forbidden fruit? That's all for another episode. Seek answers in the truth. Don't get caught up in the hysteria. Look at the facts around you. And when you investigate something, learn about the people behind it. They may expose themselves. The important thing is the truth. You cannot protect your kids by making human trafficking a one term, just encompasses every crime against a woman or a child. It will solve nothing. And maybe that is their goal, is to confuse everyone and to keep chaos and make it seem like it's this big, huge, growing issue so that everyone is hysterical and they can get money. Or maybe this is an issue too complicated on its own. But the truth is, there is a real problem. However, particular issues like violence against women, child sexual assault, child pornography, child molestation, these are all separate crimes committed by different perpetrators through different methods. And there's different methods to catch these people, different punishments. There's different ways to deal with it. And there's different ways to fix it. The important things that can stop human trafficking that we know for a fact are things that Tim Ballard aren't mentioning, such as poverty. You know, the one thing that Tim Ballard continues to mention is these rescues, and they need more money to rescue kids. But rescuing these kids, it just gets filled with one more kid. It's not solving anything. This isn't something you solve by snatching kids and rescuing them. There is a bigger overall global issue, a cultural problem. And the problem in society today is there's too many people under the influence of political narcotics and religious substances. Bottom line. Things have to be based on fact. They have to be based on science. And we have to have a rational approach to these problems if we truly want to protect the children and women that are being exploited and abused. There is nothing worse than to use this situation than to exploit it for personal gain, which only further abuses them, deprives them of hope, and then defrauds you. For some of you, a light bulb has already went off. For the rest of you, you may be starting to think human trafficking did kind of come out of nowhere. So, did human trafficking just explode out of nowhere? Did people start kidnapping, pedophiles just start snatching kids off the street? Or has it been around and we're just been made aware of it? Now, for those of you that grew up in my generation, if you were born somewhere in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, stranger danger hijacked our lives. Some, their entire childhood, came in with a bang and then faded away. Now suddenly we have human trafficking. For those of us that are a bit more inquisitive and observant and honest, is the LDS Church and Christian fundamentalists who've kind of hijacked certain political ideologies, are they doing more of redefining buzzwords and taglines, using little to no facts, the supernatural, and getting into other gray areas to bolster statistics and define less serious crimes as human trafficking? To expand human trafficking to also encompass what the Christian right deems as immoral. But then when you call them out on it with the facts and actual statistics, they immediately claim that you are a pedophile or support child rape. But we're going to cover that in our next episode. When did human trafficking become a problem? More importantly, why did it become a problem? What really is the agenda? I think you will be surprised. Now, those of you that read over our website probably already know and have already been informed. We've wrote about this in our other articles. For everyone else, or those of you that are a bit skeptical, I just want you to think and look at this a little deeper and beyond the headlines, beyond the 24-hour news cycle, the punchlines and the fear-mongering.